Martha, come here at once." Clarissa Holloway's voice cut through the mansion like a knife, sharp and commanding. The accusation in her tone was unmistakable. Martha James, the housekeeper who had dedicated over a decade of her life to this estate, felt her chest tighten as she rushed down the hallway. The glint of polished marble and the sparkling chandelier overhead did nothing to soften the cold dread curling in her stomach. At the top of the grand staircase stood Clarissa, her silk gown shimmering under the chandelier's light, her eyes burning with rage. In her hand, an open velvet box dangled, empty but for the imprint of where a priceless diamond necklace once lay. "Do you know what this means, Martha?" Clarissa's voice was venomous, the accusation ringing through the grand foyer. Martha's heart pounded as she realized that, tonight, everything was about to change. "Yes, ma'am, I know what it is," Martha replied, keeping her voice steady. "But I assure you, I don't know where it is." Clarissa descended the stairs with deliberate, sharp steps, her eyes never leaving Martha. "You were the last one in my study today. I trusted you to be thorough, to keep things in order," she said, her voice tightening with each word. "But now my family heirloom is missing, and the police are on their way." Martha's chest felt like it was being squeezed by an iron fist. The other staff, who had gathered around the edges of the hallway, exchanged worried glances. They had seen Clarissa's wrath before, but never like this. "Mrs. Holloway, I have never taken anything from this house. I would never betray your trust," Martha said, her voice low but firm. The years of loyalty and service she had given this family clung to each word. Before Clarissa could respond, the heavy thud of footsteps echoed as Henry Holloway appeared from the adjoining room. He wore a deep frown that deepened the lines on his otherwise refined face. "What is happening here?" His gaze moved between Clarissa and Martha, confusion and concern mingling in his eyes. Clarissa turned to him, eyes blazing. "What's happening is that your trusted housekeeper has stolen my necklace, Father's necklace. I've called the police to handle it." Henry's eyes darted to Martha, searching for answers. There was disbelief in his stare, a quiet, unspoken question. "Martha, is this true?" His voice was quieter, not accusatory, but probing. Martha's gaze did not waver. "No, sir. I did not take the necklace." The sound of the doorbell interrupted, shrill and invasive, slicing through the air like a warning bell. The police had arrived. Clarissa's expression hardened, satisfaction mingled with something else, something Martha couldn't quite place. Detective Lewis entered the foyer, his uniform pristine, eyes sharp and assessing. He glanced at Clarissa, who immediately stepped forward. "Detective, thank you for coming. This is the woman who had access to my study when the necklace disappeared." Her finger pointed like an arrow aimed straight at Martha. Lewis looked at Martha, a flicker of recognition softening his features before professionalism took over. "Mrs. James, is it true you were in the study today?" "Yes, Detective, I was. I was cleaning as I do every afternoon, but I never touched the necklace," Martha answered, her voice steady despite the pulse thudding in her ears. Lewis nodded slightly, turning to the assembled staff. "I'm going to need statements from everyone. But first, Mrs. James, I'll need you to come with me for questioning." Henry stepped forward, his expression torn between loyalty and the weight of the accusation. "Detective, is this necessary? Martha has been with us for over a decade. She's as much a part of this house as anyone." Clarissa's jaw clenched. "Henry, don't be naive. We need to set an example." Martha felt the eyes of her peers on her, some filled with sympathy, others with the quiet relief of not being in her shoes. As she nodded and moved toward Lewis, she caught sight of a movement at the far end of the hallway. It was Lillian, a young maid, her face pale, eyes wide with something like recognition or fear. But before Martha could react, the moment was gone. The sound of her shoes tapping against the polished marble floor echoed as she followed Detective Lewis to the parlor for questioning. The chandelier overhead flickered slightly, casting shadows across the room, and for the first time in years, the Holloway mansion felt more like a cage than a home. Something deep inside Martha told her that this was only the beginning, and the storm that was coming would change everything. The parlor was dimly lit, with shadows cast by the flickering flames in the grand marble fireplace. Martha sat in a high-backed chair, her posture tense, hands clasped tightly in her lap. The walls, adorned with oil paintings of the Holloway lineage, seemed to watch her silently, as if the very house were a witness to the unfolding drama. Detective Lewis paced in front of her, his eyes sharp and calculating. Outside, the muffled sounds of the staff murmuring and Clarissa's heels clicking across the floor filled the air. The accusation had spread through the mansion like wildfire, igniting whispers of disbelief and speculation. But here, in this room, Martha's heart beat with a rhythm of resolve. She knew the truth, and she clung to it like a lifeline. "Mrs. James," Detective Lewis began, breaking the silence, "I need you to tell me everything about your activities today. Leave nothing out." Martha swallowed hard, meeting his gaze. "I started my day as usual, preparing the dining room, checking the pantry supplies, and ensuring the guest rooms were in order. By mid-afternoon, I was cleaning Mrs. Holloway's study, dusting the shelves, and polishing the silver. That's all, Detective. I never touched the necklace." Lewis's eyes flickered with a hint of curiosity. "And did you notice anything unusual? Anyone coming or going while you were there?" She hesitated, recalling the faint murmur of voices she'd heard down the hall earlier, hushed and tense. But she knew how it would sound if she implicated anyone without proof. "No, sir. I was alone." The detective sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Mrs. James, you've worked here for over 10 years, correct?" "Yes," Martha said, her voice steady but laced with the weight of those years. "I have served this family faithfully." Lewis nodded, as if contemplating her answer. "And yet, you're at the center of this. Do you have any reason to believe someone might want to frame you?" Martha opened her mouth to answer, but before she could, the parlor door creaked open. Henry Holloway stepped inside, his eyes weary, shoulders slumped as if carrying the mansion's weight. "Detective, a word, please," he said, glancing at Martha with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Was it pity or something more complex? Lewis stood, following Henry to a corner where their voices lowered to whispers. Martha strained to hear, catching fragments. Clarissa's insistence doesn't add up. Deeper than we think. Henry's brows furrowed as he nodded, casting one last look at Martha before turning to leave. Lewis returned, a thoughtful line creasing his forehead. He studied Martha for a long moment, then said, "Stay here. We'll continue this shortly." Martha exhaled shakily as the door closed behind them. The room felt even more suffocating in their absence. She glanced around, eyes landing on the ornate mantel clock ticking relentlessly. Time moved forward, but she felt trapped, caught between defending her innocence and the mounting suspicion. Suddenly, a movement in the hallway drew her attention. One of the maids, Lillian, a young girl who had always shown kindness to Martha, hovered near the doorway. Her eyes were wide, darting nervously as if she'd heard something she shouldn't have. "Martha," Lillian whispered, stepping inside quickly and shutting the door. "I need to tell you something. I think I saw who was in Mrs. Holloway's study before you." Martha's eyes widened. "Lillian, you need to go to the detective and tell him everything." Lillian bit her lip, shaking her head. "I can't. If Mrs. Holloway finds out I said anything, I'll lose my job. But you deserve to know. It was Mr. Victor, that man who comes late at night sometimes. He was there, and he didn't look happy." The name sent a jolt through Martha. Victor. The enigmatic figure Clarissa had dealt with on more than one occasion, always behind closed doors and under hushed voices. A chill ran down her spine as the implications settled in. Before Martha could respond, the door opened again, and Detective Lewis returned, brows raised at seeing Lillian. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. Lillian's face flushed. "I was just bringing tea for Mrs. James," she stammered, holding up an empty tray as an excuse. Lewis's eyes narrowed, but he nodded curtly. "Fine, but leave us now." As Lillian slipped out, she threw a final, pleading glance at Martha. The small gesture was enough to ignite a spark of hope within her. She wasn't alone, and she now had a name that could unravel everything. Lewis took a seat again, leaning forward. "Now, Mrs. James, is there anything you'd like to add?" Martha straightened her back, meeting his gaze with newfound determination. "Yes, Detective, there is." Detective Lewis leaned forward, his interest piqued. Martha could feel the shift in the room, the subtle change in power as she held onto the name that might clear her path to freedom. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to breathe evenly. "Victor," she said, the name tasting foreign yet familiar on her tongue. The detective's eyes narrowed, and a silence fell so thick it seemed to dampen the sound of the ticking clock. "Victor," Lewis repeated, the syllables hanging in the air like a challenge. "Who is he?" Martha's fingers twitched on her lap. "He's been here before, always late at night, meeting with Mrs. Holloway. I don't know what their business was, but he was here today, before I entered the study." The detective's gaze hardened. It was as if a piece of a larger puzzle had clicked into place. He stood abruptly and paced the room, the floor creaking under his weight. "This changes things, Mrs. James. If what you're saying is true, we need to act fast." At that moment, the parlor door swung open again, and Henry Holloway stepped inside, followed closely by Clarissa. Her eyes were sharp, every step radiating controlled fury. "What's going on in here?" she demanded, crossing her arms. Lewis turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Holloway, I have a few more questions, and I would appreciate your cooperation." Clarissa's lips pressed into a thin line. "I've already told you everything. My necklace is missing, and the person responsible is sitting right here," she said, glaring at Martha. Martha met Clarissa's gaze, but now, for the first time, she wasn't just defending herself. She had information. "Mrs. Holloway, where was Victor this afternoon?" The question cut through the tension like a knife, and for a split second, Clarissa's mask slipped. Her eyes darted to Henry, who frowned, catching the exchange. "Victor?" Henry's voice was low, barely more than a murmur, but the weight of it filled the room. "Clarissa, who is Victor?" Clarissa's eyes narrowed, her expression hardening once more. "This is absurd. He's an associate, someone I occasionally consult for personal matters. This has nothing to do with the theft." Detective Lewis didn't miss a beat. "We'll need to speak to him. Can you tell us where to find him?" Clarissa hesitated, her composure faltering as her eyes swept the room, searching for an escape. I don't know where he is at the moment." Henry stepped closer to his wife, the tension between them palpable. "Clarissa, if there's something you're not telling us, now is the time." Before she could respond, there was a commotion from outside the parlor. One of the junior maids, pale and shaking, burst through the doorway. "Pardon me, but there's a man outside. He's demanding to see Mrs. Holloway." Clarissa's face blanched. Martha felt her breath hitch as she glanced at Lewis, who signaled to the officer at the door. "Bring him in," the detective ordered. The silence stretched taut as footsteps approached. Then, a tall figure in a dark coat stepped into the room. His presence seemed to pull the air out of the space. Victor, with his dark eyes and sharp features, stood in the doorway, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Good evening, everyone," Victor said smoothly, his voice like velvet laced with poison. His gaze swept over the occupants before settling on Clarissa. "I hear there's been a misunderstanding." Clarissa's composure cracked, the confident facade slipping away to reveal the fear beneath. Henry's jaw tightened as he exchanged a look with Lewis, whose eyes shone with newfound urgency. "Victor," Lewis said, his tone steady, "we have some questions for you regarding a theft that occurred in this house today. I trust you'll cooperate." Victor's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, Detective. I'm always happy to clear up misunderstandings. But I wonder, are you all prepared for what you're about to uncover?" The room went silent again, the unspoken truths swirling like a storm about to break. The parlor was thick with silence, each breath drawn by the occupants sounding loud against the tension crackling in the air. Victor's presence changed the atmosphere, turning what had once been mere accusations into something more dangerous. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who knew he was in control, even when surrounded by eyes that saw him as an intruder. Detective Lewis gestured toward a chair. "Victor, have a seat. We have questions that need answers." Victor's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a cool, composed expression as he settled into the chair. His dark eyes met Clarissa's, and something unsaid passed between them, an understanding built on secrets. Henry, watching intently, caught the exchange and felt his pulse quicken. Whatever this was, it was more than he'd ever suspected. "Mrs. Holloway," Lewis said, turning to Clarissa with a hard stare, "you've been withholding information. This man, Victor, isn't just an associate, is he?" Clarissa's fingers dug into her arms as she crossed them over her chest, her eyes refusing to meet her husband's. "Detective, this is getting out of hand." "I didn't." "Let me save you the trouble," Victor interjected smoothly. "I was in Mrs. Holloway's study today. We were discussing a private matter, unrelated to any theft." Lewis's eyebrows shot up. "So, you admit to being in the room where the necklace went missing?" Victor leaned back, crossing one leg over the other with practiced ease. "I do, but I didn't take the necklace." His eyes flicked to Martha, and a shadow of a smile ghosted his lips. "And neither did Mrs. James." Clarissa inhaled sharply, her composure fracturing further. Henry noticed, and the realization hit him like a punch. "Clarissa, what have you done?" he asked, his voice low and strained. Victor's gaze moved to Henry, his expression shifting from casual indifference to a more serious tone. "Your wife, Mr. Holloway, found herself in a situation where she needed resources. Desperation leads to risky decisions." Clarissa's face flushed red, her mask fully shattered. "That's enough, Victor," she snapped, her voice laced with panic. "You said you wouldn't say anything." Martha's heart pounded as the room seemed to close in around them. The staff, who had crept closer to hear the drama unfold, exchanged uneasy glances. This was no longer a simple accusation. It was an unraveling of the fabric that held the Holloway household together. Detective Lewis stepped forward, his expression hardening. "What exactly were you discussing, Victor?" Victor's smirk returned. "Clarissa and I were discussing debts. Substantial ones. The necklace was supposed to serve as collateral until things could be arranged. But someone got ahead of themselves." His eyes flicked to Martha again, a glint of something unreadable flashing across his face. Clarissa's hands trembled. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she whispered, the weight of her choices visibly breaking her down. Henry stared at her, stunned and silent, as if trying to piece together the woman he married with the one standing before him. Lewis's voice cut through the room. "So the necklace was never stolen, but it was planned to be moved without Mr. Holloway's knowledge?" This was a setup to shift blame. He turned to Clarissa, who looked away, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Before anyone could react further, Victor stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "Now, I think we've all said enough for one evening. Detective, if you have questions, I'll be available at my office tomorrow. But for now, I suggest you reassess where your suspicions lie. Lewis's jaw clenched, but he gave a curt nod. We're not done here, Victor. Not by a long shot. Victor inclined his head and walked out, his footsteps echoing down the hall. The room was left in stunned silence, with only the sound of Martha's steady breathing to anchor the moment. Clarissa's face crumpled, the realization of her exposure finally sinking in. Henry's voice, now hoarse with emotion, broke through. Clarissa, is it true? Did you risk everything for this? Clarissa's eyes, hollow and filled with regret, met his. But before she could answer, Martha spoke, her voice soft but strong. Sir, this isn't just about a necklace anymore. It's about the secrets that have been hidden for far too long. The parlor remained a battleground of silence and disbelief. Henry's gaze was fixed on Clarissa, whose face had lost its usual confident poise, leaving behind only vulnerability and guilt. Martha stood quietly, watching the cracks in the Holloway family widen, unsure whether this moment would lead to justice or ruin. Detective Lewis took a step forward, his eyes shifting from Clarissa to Henry and then to Martha. He was piecing together a story more complex than a simple theft, a web of decisions driven by desperation, pride, and betrayal. Mrs. Holloway, it's time we hear the whole truth. The only way forward is honesty. Clarissa's eyes flickered with a mix of fear and defiance. The truth, she said, almost as if the word was foreign. Her voice wavered, but she drew herself up, the last vestiges of her pride trying to mask the cracks. Yes, I was desperate. Yes, I reached out to Victor for help. Our finances, they weren't what Henry thought they were. Henry's brow furrowed deeply, the revelation striking him harder than any accusation. Clarissa, what are you talking about? Our accounts. We're bleeding money, Clarissa interrupted, her tone sharp as she finally let go of the facade. The parties, the investments that failed, the lifestyle we kept to maintain appearances, it was all falling apart. I did what I had to do to keep us from losing everything. Martha felt a pang of sympathy mixed with anger. The sacrifices she had made for the Holloways seemed small in comparison to the secret life Clarissa had been living. Lewis's eyes narrowed, the gears turning as he connected the dots. And the necklace, he pressed, pushing for more. Clarissa exhaled shakily, her gaze dropping. Victor suggested using it as collateral for a loan, a temporary solution, he said. But when I realized how far I had gone, I panicked. I never meant for Martha to be accused. That was not my intention. Henry stepped back, as if he'd been struck, the weight of betrayal crushing down on him. His voice, raw and strained, asked, "And you didn't think to tell me? To trust me?" Clarissa looked up, tears pooling in her eyes. I was afraid, Henry. Afraid that admitting failure would mean losing everything. This life. All of it. The room fell silent again, the echo of her confession reverberating off the polished walls. Martha took a small step forward, feeling the need to speak. Detective Lewis, it's clear that Mrs. Holloway's actions were driven by desperation, not malice. But there is more to consider. Victor's involvement. What is his real role in all of this? Lewis nodded, acknowledging her point. We need to dig deeper into Victor's connections and what he stands to gain from this arrangement. At that moment, a soft knock came at the parlor door. One of the junior maids, eyes wide with nerves, peeked inside. Detective, there's a man outside. He says he has information about Victor. Lewis's eyes brightened with newfound urgency. Bring him in, he commanded. The door opened wider, and an older man stepped inside, his posture stooped, but his eyes sharp with determination. He introduced himself as Thomas, a former employee of Victor's who had been dismissed under suspicious circumstances. His presence cast a new shadow over the room. I know things about Victor, Thomas said, his voice gravelly but strong. Things that could explain why he's involved with your family. And it's not just about money. Clarissa's eyes widened in alarm, and Henry exchanged a glance with Lewis. The tension was almost unbearable, as if the mansion itself were holding its breath, waiting for the next revelation that would shatter what little remained of its fragile peace. The parlor was filled with a tense silence as Thomas, the unexpected visitor, stood at the center of the room. His presence felt like a storm brewing, promising to unravel more than anyone anticipated. The Holloways, Detective Lewis, Martha, and even the maids who hovered near the edges of the room all waited for him to speak, their collective breath held. "Victor is not just a businessman," Thomas began, his voice deep and rough, hinting at years of hard living. "He deals in things that stay hidden: debts, secrets, blackmail. And he has a network that stretches far beyond this mansion." Clarissa's face paled further, and Henry clenched his fists at his sides, a muscle in his jaw twitching. "Why would someone like Victor get involved with my family?" Henry's voice was strained, carrying a mix of confusion and dread. Thomas's eyes flickered with a trace of pity. "Because your name, Mr. Holloway, is powerful. People trust it. Victor planned to leverage that trust to manipulate more than just your finances. He needed your reputation as collateral." Martha's heart thudded heavily in her chest. Everything suddenly made more sense. The late-night visits, the whispers that always followed Victor's departures, and Clarissa's increasingly erratic behavior over the past few months. Detective Lewis stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "And what about the necklace? How does that fit into this scheme?" Thomas nodded, as if he expected the question. The necklace was the bait. It was meant to be stolen and sold quietly to draw attention away from the larger sum Victor intended to extract from your accounts. But when Mrs. Holloway hesitated, things got complicated. Clarissa's eyes brimmed with unshed tears, and her voice came out in a broken whisper. "I couldn't go through with it, but it was in too deep. Victor knew it. He threatened to expose everything if I didn't follow through." A wave of realization washed over Henry, and the betrayal in his eyes softened just a bit, replaced by sorrow. He stepped toward Clarissa, but before he could speak, the door burst open again. This time, Victor himself strode in, flanked by two men who exuded menace. "Enough," Victor said, his voice smooth and confident as ever. The room froze as his gaze swept over everyone. "I see the party started without me." His smile was cold, eyes glinting with a predator's awareness. Lewis's hand twitched near his holster, but he kept his composure. "Victor, you're interfering with an ongoing investigation. I suggest you leave." Victor's smile widened, and he shook his head. "You misunderstand, Detective. This isn't an investigation. This is my business, and it's time to wrap up loose ends." Clarissa's breath came in shallow gasps, and Martha felt a cold dread settle into her bones. Victor's casual tone carried a threat, one that promised consequences far beyond accusations and stolen jewelry. "Let's be clear," Victor continued, stepping further into the room. "Everyone here has a role to play. Mrs. Holloway, you were supposed to keep this under control. You failed, and now we're cleaning up your mess." Thomas took a step forward, defiance sparking in his aged eyes. "You won't get away with this, Victor. The truth will come out." Victor's gaze darkened, and a flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "The truth." He chuckled darkly. "The truth doesn't matter when I control the narrative." Martha felt a surge of courage, born from the helplessness that had weighed on her all evening. "You don't control everyone, Victor. People see more than you think. And if you think fear will keep us silent, you're wrong." Victor's smile faltered, and for a brief moment, his confidence wavered. But the silence that followed was broken by the unmistakable sound of sirens, loud and approaching fast. Lewis's expression shifted to one of controlled triumph as the sound filled the room. "Looks like you're out of time, Victor," Lewis said, stepping closer. The tension in the room broke like a dam as Victor's eyes darted around, calculating his next move. But it was too late. The truth, tangled and ugly, was about to come to light. The sirens grew louder, piercing through the heavy silence of the room. Victor's confident demeanor shifted as realization dawned. His window of control was slipping away. The two men flanking him exchanged nervous glances, their stances losing the assuredness they had held moments before. Martha's pulse raced as she saw the shifting tides. For the first time that night, hope sparked within her. Detective Lewis kept his gaze fixed on Victor, his posture solid and unwavering. "It's over, Victor. Step away from Mrs. Holloway, and let's end this without further damage." Victor's eyes narrowed, calculating his options. He took a step back, the glimmer of confidence replaced by a thin sheen of desperation. "You think this changes anything, Detective? Even if you arrest me, there are others who know more than you can imagine." Clarissa let out a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her guilt and fear. Henry stepped closer to her, placing a hand on her arm, the gesture a mix of anger and reluctant support. "Clarissa, whatever happens, we face it together," he said, his voice soft but resolute. The police officers outside moved in, their footsteps echoing through the hallway as they entered the parlor. "Victor Reynolds," one of them called out, "you are under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and extortion." They moved swiftly, cuffing his wrists as he glared at everyone in the room with cold, burning eyes. As Victor was led away, he passed by Martha and paused, leaning in close enough that only she could hear. "You might have won this round, but the game isn't over." His whisper sent a shiver down her spine, but she stood her ground, meeting his gaze with unwavering defiance. Thomas, who had watched the entire scene with a sense of vindication, finally relaxed. "It's about time," he muttered, crossing his arms as if a long chapter of his life had just been closed. Detective Lewis turned to the Holloways, his eyes softening just enough to show that he recognized the turmoil they faced. "Mr. and Mrs. Holloway, there will be more questions, and this investigation isn't over. But tonight, you're safe." Clarissa's eyes filled with tears, a complex mixture of relief and regret. She looked at Martha, who stood quietly, observing the aftermath. "Martha, I'm sorry," Clarissa whispered, her voice breaking. Martha nodded slowly, a tight smile forming on her lips. "It's not just about apologies, Mrs. Holloway. It's about change." Henry placed a hand on Martha's shoulder. "Martha, you've been loyal to this family beyond what we deserved. I see that now. And things will be different, I promise." The parlor, which had been a cage of suspicion and lies, now felt different, still heavy, but with a sense of closure. The police led Victor and his men out, their shadows stretching across the floor as the night swallowed them. Outside, the flashing lights of the police cars illuminated the manicure lawn and the towering facade of the mansion. The air was cool, and Martha stepped outside, breathing deeply as if for the first time in hours. The night, though tense and unforgiving, had revealed the truth, and with it came the possibility of new beginnings. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a soft, forgiving glow on the Holloway estate. The echoes of last night's revelations lingered in the silence of the house, whispering truths that could no longer be ignored. Martha stood in the kitchen, cradling a cup of tea, the warmth grounding her after the storm of accusations and confessions. The mansion, once a symbol of control and grandeur, now felt different, quieter, almost humbled. Henry entered, the weight of the night etched into the lines of his face. His shirt was wrinkled, and the top button of his collar was undone, revealing the strain he had endured. His eyes met Martha's, carrying both exhaustion and a newfound clarity. "Martha," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to express my gratitude. What you did, standing firm, revealing the truth, saved this family from ruin." Martha placed her cup down on the counter, meeting his gaze. "Mr. Holloway, it wasn't easy, but the truth needed to come out, not just for me, but for all of us. This house needed a reckoning, Henry nodded, his expression softening. And that reckoning has brought change. I promise, from now on, things will be different here. For you. For everyone. Before Martha could respond, the soft sound of footsteps came from the hallway. Clarissa stood at the threshold, eyes rimmed red, her usually perfect composure shattered into something more human. She looked older, wearier, as if the weight of her choices had aged her overnight. "Martha," she said, voice wavering, "I owe you more than an apology. I let my fear and ambition consume me, and in doing so, I wronged you. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I need you to know I am truly sorry." Martha studied Clarissa's face, searching for sincerity. The woman before her was not the cold, imperious lady of the house she had served for years, but someone who had been humbled by her mistakes. "Apologies are a start, Mrs. Holloway," Martha said quietly. "But change takes more than words. It takes actions." Clarissa nodded, a tear escaping and sliding down her cheek. "I understand, and I'm prepared to show that change." The silence that followed was one of acceptance, tentative and fragile, but real. It was the beginning of healing, a thread of hope weaving through the wreckage of the night before. The sound of a car engine approaching broke the moment, followed by a knock at the front door. Henry walked to answer it, and there stood Detective Lewis, hat in hand, the morning light casting long shadows across the marble floor. "Good morning, Mr. Holloway, Mrs. James," he said, nodding to Martha as she joined Henry at the door. "I wanted to inform you that Victor has been taken into custody. His network is being dismantled, and while there's more work to do, you're safe now." Henry extended his hand, gratitude softening the weariness in his eyes. "Thank you, Detective, for everything." Lewis shook his hand, then turned to Martha, a hint of admiration in his expression. "And Mrs. James, your bravery exposed more than just a crime. You stood up for what was right, and that's no small thing." A warmth spread through Martha's chest, a validation she hadn't realized she craved. "Thank you, Detective." As Lewis left, the first rays of sunlight spilled through the open door, filling the foyer with golden light. Henry turned back to Martha, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth despite the exhaustion. "Martha, this house, this family, we owe you a debt we can't repay. I'd like you to stay on, not just as our housekeeper, but as a respected part of our household." Clarissa stepped forward, her voice soft but hopeful. "And I hope, one day, we can rebuild trust. It won't be easy, but I'm ready to try." Martha felt a small, genuine smile form on her lips. "We all have a lot to rebuild, Mrs. Holloway, but today feels like a good start." Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, its light spreading across the estate, illuminating every corner of the mansion that had once been shrouded in secrets. Now, with shadows lifted and truth exposed, the Holloway estate stood ready for a new chapter, one marked by honesty, resilience, and the strength found in facing the past head-on. Now that you've followed this story full of twists and emotions, we'd love to hear from you. Comment below and share what you thought about the plot and which moment was your favorite or most gripping. Don't forget to leave a like. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. This way, you won't miss any new stories we share. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next story.